topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. This show has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. And I'm happy to share that this show has been ranked on the top 10 most inspirational leadership podcasts on the web. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, and if we've not met, I am an organizational psychologist and logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto Now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a culture and leadership activated by meaning and purpose. Our mission is to help our clients create a destination workplace where people flock to join, are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, can grow into their full potential, and are committed to stay and to deliver on the company's mission, all which translates to higher profits for you. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Getting into today's program, we have with us today Karena Kilcoyne, a former trial lawyer who specialized in criminal defense, including complex white-collar and civil litigation in federal and state courts. Today, she passionately shares her own personal story of trauma and healing to teach others how to rise above their own stories and find true peace and emotional freedom. She's the author of Rise Above the Story, Free Yourself from Past Trauma and Create the Life You Want, which we'll be talking about today. She joins us today from Tampa, Florida. Karena, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you, Elise. I'm so happy to be here.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading every single word of this beautiful book that you created. And I'm really impressed. What I want to start with is, it's both really beautifully written, but it's also incredibly transparent and personal. So the very first thing that I have to ask you, my friend, is how did you summon the courage, the bravery to be that brave and bold in what you shared?
It is true. I am very honest and transparent and raw in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that courage came in levels and layers and stages. So there was so much of my life that was stowed away. And I was so ashamed of so much of what I went through that I was stuffed and suppressed so much of who I was and who I thought I was and where I came from. So I would say that after, decades of living like that, I understood when I started to go on my healing journey that I had to go back in there to those dark places of where I hid all those pieces of myself and bring them into the light. So through therapy and the different modalities of therapy I've tried, they would come out piece by piece, little by little. And then I started to realize that there was no shame in what I had experienced. And I started to take a lot of pride in who I was at those different points in my life. And that was kind of the first level and the first layer and the first unpeeling of it, if you really consider it like an onion almost. And then I would say I really got courageous about it when I realized at the end of it all that I really wanted to create this book, that I wanted to write essentially a guidebook for people on how to heal from trauma. And I knew that to do that, I had to do it authentically and to really share my journey. I had to share those stories, my past stories, my history. And I knew that if I could show people, if I could take people along through my own personal journey and show them through example of what it feels like and what it looks like to share yourself in that way, that the book would be so powerful and authentic for people and would really encourage them to do the same. And that's really what healing takes, is to find that courage to go back into the past and pull forward those pieces of yourself that you left behind.
Beautifully rendered and kicking us off, Karena. So since I have read the book and I do know about the trauma that you're talking about, because you really detail it in the book very well, but our listeners and viewers don't yet know. So let's situate that next so they understand really what you were pulling from.
So I was born in a rusted out steel town on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. I came from a very dysfunctional, violent family. My mother and father fought and argued as long as I can remember, as far back as I can remember. The number of incidents that I witnessed and was involved in trying to protect my mother in domestic violence situations, countless. My father started to have legal trouble. He was a very astute businessman, my father, and very much a hustler. And when he was in the picture, we had a good living, we had a good lifestyle. But when he was not in the picture, we didn't. And he got in trouble with the law when I would say I was about 11. I remember the FBI starting to surveil our home and such. And he went to prison, to the federal penitentiary. And when he left, my mother, who suffered from mental health issues, was unable to cope. She was unable to cope with the stress, with the financial aspect of him leaving us as a family. And at the time when he left, there was me. I was the oldest, and I had a younger brother and a younger sister. I was about 12 when all of this was going on. And my mother, like I said, was just really unable to cope. So there were long periods, stretches of time where she would be in bed, depressed. And this was, the 80s in Ohio, and people weren't going to psychologists in that group and in that era. So if I had to look back on it now, knowing what I know about mental health, I would speculate that my mother had severe depression, anxiety, and probably some kind of bipolar. There were massive bouts of spending the money that my father left us on silly things. And then we were in extreme poverty. We would go without hot water, without electricity, countless times. I remember sharing a bathtub of tepid water that I would make up, and my brothers and sister and I would bathe one after the other. A few years later, my mother had my youngest brother. And I decided that I was going to get myself out of all of this. And the only road I saw out of all this poverty and all of this chaos was through education. So I was a good student, and I would always prioritize education. And I chose to go to law school. So I put myself through law school. But there was a little bit more trauma that occurred during that time. And that was when I was in my early 20s, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. So even during law school, I was taking care of her while she was dying. When I was 24, my mother died, and I adopted my 9-year-old brother. So there was this trauma, of course, situational trauma, family trauma, but there was this bigger problem, which was that I never had the space to process it.
Yeah.
I didn't have the tools, and none of us do at that age. And I wasn't with a parent who knew how to help me process it. And I never, as I got older, didn't even know the difference of what that meant. I didn't know how to do it. So I continued to suppress it. And then adopting my 9-year-old brother put me even deeper into fight or flight, into survival mode, because it wasn't just me anymore that I was trying to make sure that I survived. It was now my 9-year-old brother. So it was quite a long time of quite a many years of trauma. And then it was this idea and this huge burden I carried of carrying all of this old emotional energy in me that continued to feel like trauma over and over and over again.
Yeah. Such a burden. And if I remember right too, your mother also tried to give you away when you were first born. She told you that somehow.
Yes.
Right. There was that
Yes,
little thing, which is a really heavy thing to carry as a child, to know that your mother tells you that she tried to give you away. So I wanted to make sure that our listeners and viewers kind of were anchored in what kind of trauma we were talking about here and the length of it, so that they could understand just why you've been so motivated to write this book, to research this book and write this book. I am curious how, if at all, your experience as a trial attorney served you to in the research, the writing, and in the healing journey? Just, I can't imagine that it wasn't present.
Yes, it absolutely was present. And so this whole, even younger than, even, when I was younger than going through college and law school, I loved to read. That was my escape. That was my world. I got to live in other places besides the traumatized, violent world in which I was being raised. So reading and, books and storytelling was always a thing for me. But law school and the way they teach you to think in law school, and then as a trial lawyer, the main skills that I took that transposed so beautifully into this is the idea, especially in trial work, of taking really complicated matters and distilling them down into such simple form so that people like jurors can understand what you're saying. And so the law can be very complex. And then, there are certain types of law I practice. So even when I got into more white collar criminal defense, and there are, complicated financial aspects in addition to criminal law aspects that you had to explain to jurors, that is a skill that you learn in law school, and that is a skill that you develop as a lawyer. So in writing this book, I had to take really complicated ideas. And this is all things that I went through on my own healing journey. I am such a researcher and such a reader and such a nerd about health and mental health and emotional health and physical health. So it was always something I was interested in. But when you really get into the ideas of trauma and what it does to you and what it does to your brain, or what your brain is doing in the presence of trauma, it's really complicated. And a lot of times I think that is what makes people shy away from it. They don't really want to get into that aspect. And so they keep going to somebody, to a therapist, like, well, just tell me and tell me how to fix it. And that's not really how it works. You have to be very proactive in your healing. So what I really wanted to do was do exactly what I did as a trial lawyer, is take this really complicated information about your brain and what it does in the presence of trauma and simplify it for people in one chapter so that people could really understand it. And I will say that it is a lot of, you and people out there, who love to read, have written books. It's a lot. It takes a long time to write a book. It takes a really long time to write a really good book. And really what you try to do is you put it all out there and you really try to simplify it for people. And that chapter I wrote on the brain science was the chapter that took me the most, not because of the information, but because I wanted to make it so simple. I wanted to keep, making it simple. So that, as you asked, the qualities and the skills that I learned and I developed came in super handy in writing this kind of a book.
Indeed. Well, kudos. I mean, it is, you're right. I mean, I've been hosting the show for 9.5 years, Karena, and I generally bring on authors and I read their books cover to cover. So I've got a really quite a deep experience in, how to be able to read books and looking at how they're organized and how well can I understand them. And the easier it is to understand, the better written it is. So here we go. Well, so let's situate here before we take our first break here, this idea. I mean, everybody's heard the idea. Everybody has a story. Of course, we all have a story. But you have a particular way of describing just what stories are that I think it would be helpful to say at this point. What are stories in your view?
Stories are your brain's emotional interpretation of what happened to you. So the traumatic response is, there's an objective quality to it. There's an objective nature to you experience something traumatic. That goes without a doubt. But the story that we all have, because we all have one or 100, but the story we all have about ourselves, I'm unlovable, I'm not worthy, I'm always abandoned, I'm not worth being loved, like whatever your story is, and those three were always, my story. But whatever your story is, it comes from your brain's subjective emotional interpretation of what happened to you. And it creates that story for you to keep you, quote unquote, safe.
Beautifully rendered. And that is going to set us up here, ladies and gentlemen, for what we're going to cover after the break. So we're going to get into the difference between the emotional and the thinking brain in terms of all this sort of thing. But let us take our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Karena Kilcoyne, who shares her own personal story of trauma and healing to teach others how to rise above their own stories and find true peace and emotional freedom. We've been talking a bit about where this book came from, why it's important. After the break, we're going to get into this, more of the nitty-gritty of the techniques that she covers. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As I am dedicated to creating a world where people can realize their potential at work and are led by inspirational leaders, and they are part of an organization that does business that betters the world, I keep researching and writing my own books. So the last one came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it for leaders to really understand the lay of today's talent landscape. What do they want to stay motivated and to stay with you? And then I offer 22 best practices to help equip the organization's culture to be able to provide that. You can find my books at elisecortez.com or on Amazon. If you are just joining the program, my guest today is Karena Kilcoyne. She's the author of Rise Above the Story, Free Yourself from Past Trauma and Create the Life You Want, which is what we're talking about today. So now I appreciate very much how you did distill. As an organizational psychologist, right, I've studied a lot about emotions in the brain, et cetera. And I like how you describe the brain as a master storyteller, and then you distinguish the emotional and thinking brains. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit for us?
Yes. So as we were discussing earlier, the brain is so complicated and complex when it comes to trauma and what it does in the face of trauma. So I read a lot of books, and one of the things that I learned in my healing journey was how important the role of your brain is and understanding how your brain works when these traumatic things happen to us, what your brain is doing. And when I first learned these ideas, it's the thing that really broke me open the most. It seemed so like just the light went on. Like it was like, oh my gosh. So all this time and all these years, I have been defaulting to this mindset, to these stories, to these limiting stories of who I thought I was because of how my brain works. So the way I describe it in my book, again, really simplified, but I wanted people to really be able to absorb this and understand it. So the way I describe it is there's two parts to your brain: the emotional brain, which is comprised of the reptilian part of your brain and the mammalian part of your brain. And those two parts of your brain register and control all the things you have no control over: your breathing, your heart rate, all these things. So those two parts of your brain also control fight or flight. So if something happens to you, some kind of, you're in danger, like the old stories about like a dinosaur's chasing you, a bear's chasing you, something's chasing you, your body goes into this whole alert system of staying and fighting or running away. There's also the idea of freezing. But that emotional part of your brain, as I call it, is what controls all of the things that you don't even think about. Mm-hmm. And then there's your thinking brain, which is what I kind of group together as your cortex, your cerebral cortex, your frontal cortex. So all these areas of your brain, the upper part of your brain, that are the more sophisticated parts of your brain, that are free will, that all of these ideas about self-awareness, self-love. It's all of that all happens in this different part of your brain that I call the thinking brain. in the book. So where it goes awry is when you experience trauma and your emotional brain, in order to keep you safe, registers and ignites this fight or flight response. And when it does that, it does all these things physically to your body, right? But it also creates a story that keeps you safe, as I said earlier, quote unquote safe, because what your brain is doing, your emotional brain is doing, is it is trying to make sure that you don't get hurt. The brain is wired first and foremost for survival. So when you experience something traumatic, your emotional brain initiates fight or flight, and it creates a story in your head that keeps you living a smaller life. Like, oh, I don't know, don't take that risk. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't quit your job. I wouldn't follow that dream. What if that doesn't pan out? What if you don't make the money that you're going to make? I wouldn't fall for that person. I wouldn't do that. What if they don't love you back? What if they leave you? Everybody leaves you. These are the kinds of negative self loops that play in our head, and they're all brought about by the emotional brain. So how do we stop those? How do we stop the fear loop, the negative self-talk? How do we get out of it? We create self-awareness. And you do that in your thinking brain. So we all have these loops. In fact, I just saw this great reel on Instagram, and it's a comedian. He had Jerry Seinfeld on. And he said, Jerry Seinfeld, you have written, arguably the best show ever on television. Do you still have that negative voice in your head when you're writing? And do you know Jerry Seinfeld said, yes, I do every day. My inner voice tells me I am not a good writer. I am a comedian. I'm not this, I'm not that. And I'm thinking, see, everybody's story. And so what you want to do is you want to get into the self-awareness where you know what the story is and you stop it. You find the awareness about it, you hear the story, and you reset yourself and you say, that's not true. This trauma isn't happening anymore. I don't have to stay in the safe box anymore. That's not happening to me anymore. So it's all about developing the self-awareness and this pattern of self-awareness. And that's ultimately, once you start getting that going, like an engine revving, like once you get enough of that self-awareness going, the stories don't ever completely stop, but they get lighter, and you know how to put them in their place, and you know how to say, I know you're trying to protect me, emotional brain, but I don't need that right now. What I need right now is to take this risk. I need to make this jump. I need to tell this person I love them, right? So that's where we get into the difference, because your brain is a master storyteller. And if you default to your emotional brain and you let your emotional brain tell you what's happening, you are living a limited, small life.
No question. I think so much. I've had so many amazing people on this program over the years, Karena. And one of the things we've talked about is just if we could literally spring more people so that they're operating from much more of all of their talents and their capabilities, and they were then empowered to contribute those, what kind of a world will we be living in? It's amazing, right? It's just amazing. So the limitation is incredible. Now, what you were talking about, that three-step process that you just mentioned to us, is that the same thing as removing the victim mindset, or is that something else?
The victim mindset, removing that is definitely related and parallel.
Okay.
I would say that to me, this was a huge part of my healing. I carried around for decades this idea that, like, I was the daughter of a felon. And, if people knew that about me, what would they think? Who am I because I'm the daughter of a felon? And so I had to let that go if I wanted to get to the next phase of healing. So to me, that came out to be that I had to know, I boiled it down to basically 3 steps that I put in the book of realizations I had about victimhood. And the first one is that the trauma, the bad thing that happened to you, to any of us, doesn't happen because we deserve it.
Okay.
We get into this mentality that, oh, somehow when something bad happens to us, we caused it, or it's our fault, or we could have said no, or we should have done this stuff differently. And that's just human nature. That's, again, something the brain does. And what we need to realize is that that's not the truth. That's not reality. That the bad thing didn't happen because we deserved it. The second thing we need to do is again, know that this idea, you're right, this parallel here is that your story is a distortion. It is your brain, your emotional brain creating this loop that's trying to keep you pushed down and safe within the little bubble it's creating for you. So your story about your abandonment or your worthlessness, your unlovability, or your that you fail at everything, that's a distortion.
Yeah.
And the third thing about the victim mindset is that to get out of it, you have to understand that and accept and look for the bigger purpose and what happened. There is always one. It's hard to pinpoint sometimes because, especially when it's something so terrible and so traumatic, but there's always something if you can find it, a silver lining, a bigger purpose, some benefit that came out of it for you. And all the times I talk about this in groups and I speak, and that's the one that gets people the most, because they think, what good could have come out of that? But there is, if you look. It might be that you moved. It might be that you took another job. It might be that you met somebody different. It might be that you learned something new about yourself. There could always be a silver lining. And resetting your brain from negative to positive takes that kind of self-awareness. It takes that kind of using the thinking brain to analyze a situation and to say, there was something bigger and brighter for this that happened to me. I know it.
Mm-hmm. What I love about that, Karena, and what I align with, I'm among other things, I'm a meaning and work and identity researcher. And when we look at what we've gone through, what things that we've had to like crawl through the mud through to get to the other side, or what we've transcended, if we peel that back and say, if that hadn't happened to me, what would I not have become as a result? So then we see how those things really layered into our sense of identity and our sense of strength and perspective and talents and skills. And I think that's a lot of what we can get in terms of that silver lining that you talk about.
And true. And I would say this too, that I look back on my life and I think, would I ever want to go through all of that again? Absolutely not. But standing where I stand today, am I thankful for it all? Absolutely. I wouldn't be, like you said, I wouldn't be who I am today had I not gone through all of that. So I love what you said. I think that's beautiful.
Thank you. I am really, as I was thinking about you coming on the program today, I was thinking, I really am convinced that, the people that have really done something in their lives, they've gone through this stuff. It's almost like not quite a direct correlation, but there's something in it. Like we humans, almost need to be catalyzed. It's Ram Dass would call it the sandpaper of life, right? And so your story, you couldn't have written this book. You couldn't be doing the work that you're doing today in the world had you not had to go through and find a way through all of that trauma that you had in life. You wouldn't be equipped.
Absolutely. That's so true.
So you have a way, this idea of rising above the story. You have a method for that, a methodology for that. And I don't know if the steps you've already covered really speak to that, but I think everybody who's listening at this point is like, okay, great. I know I've got a story. How do I rise above it?
So I love this question because, again, to this point of, I wanted to create a guidebook for people. There are a lot of beautiful books out there, and actually really heady, intelligent books out there on trauma. And I actually read them and quote a lot of them in the book. And there's, 72 endnotes in my book. So there's a lot of these big ideas. And if you want to go back and research, some other things or dive deeper, that's great. But what I wanted to do is really simplify the journey for people through reading the passages of my book. So I took my own healing journey and what worked for me, and I broke it down into 3 steps. And the 3 steps, the 3 big steps, and there's lots of fun things under each step, but the 3 big steps are acknowledging your story, number 1. And that's sometimes the most powerful, most difficult work for people, because so many times, like I said, we're walking around the earth with our head in the sand or our head in the clouds about, oh yeah, I guess this is just the life I have, because, they're defaulting their emotional brain. So acknowledging your story is this idea of what happened to me, and really analyzing this objective and the subjective part of it. So, I give this example in the book
Yes.
a trial experience, right? And I really like to explain this to people this way. So if you were testifying on the stand, let's say you were robbed, and you're testifying on the stand, and you're supposed to be talking about what happened to you, and they're asking you very factual questions. They want to know, where were you? What did the person look like? What did they say to you? What were they wearing? And instead of giving them the who, what, where, when of what happened to you, you sit on the stand and you say, oh my God, the whole thing was my fault. I shouldn't have been out after midnight. Why was I walking the street like that? I shouldn't have been on the left side. I should have been on the right side, and I should never have been wearing my good watch. So that would be objected to all over the place in a court of law, and you would be driven back to the objective facts of what happened. So similar in this, acknowledging your story, understanding the objective part of what happened to you, laying that out. Yes, this happened to me, A, B, and C, no doubt about it. But the next part is acknowledging the story that your brain wrote about it. In my case, my story, or my objective thing was my father went to prison. The story I wrote about it was that I was unworthy and unlovable because my father included left me when I was little.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a story that we create. So acknowledging that story, and that you're telling yourself a story, and that you're living in a little bubble of your story, is the number one part. The second part is releasing your story. Second big step. This is all this idea of, okay, now you acknowledged it. We have to go back a little bit further and understand how you got so tangled up in it, all the times it repeated itself, how patterns happened, how it took over your life. And then you start doing some work on releasing the story. And that's a lot of work about, your inner child work, forgiveness. It's all these types of things in there. Then the third step is rising above your story. And this is all about finding real self-love, and how you tap into that, and how you finally, after all this time, know exactly who you are, and you love exactly who you are, and you're not ashamed of it, and you put it out into the world. Because as you said earlier, could you imagine a world where we all did that? Where we have these gifts in us, and we have them, but we tend to bury them, and because we got the emotional loop going, yeah, you're not good at that. I wouldn't do that. You'll fail at that. Don't do that. So can you imagine? So it's all about, I teach you all the ways in which I do this, unearthing, excavating the real you, and loving the real you. So
that's the world that I want to live in, Karena. That's where I want to live.
Yes.
Let's grab our next break here. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're going to hear with Karena Kilcoyne, who shares her own personal story of trauma and healing to teach others to rise above their own stories and find true peace and emotional freedom. We're getting more into the details of just how it is that we tell the stories, how we are a master storyteller. After the break, we're going to talk more about how to extract our true self to be very powerful. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my last book came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization. What I did for you is I built you a 3-page assessment you can pull off my website to learn the extent to which your organization is actually operating it for today's talent discerning standards. You can find it at gusto-now.com. If you are just now joining the program, my guest is Karena Kilcoyne. She's the author of Rise Above the Story, Free Yourself from Past Trauma and Create the Life You Want. So as we were on break there, I was thinking about this, Karena, and one thing that I want to say to our listeners and viewers is that None of us are immune to trauma and pain. We are all walking wounded human beings. And my work inside organizations to help develop leaders and cultures that are really destination in nature. Think about how many, there are so many people that have no idea how truly wounded they are. If they did this kind of work that Karena is putting forth, they wouldn't be the tyrants that you actually report to, or maybe they would, create a whole new company that would be something else. So I really am a huge fan of this work, Karena. It's so, so, so important. One of the many reasons I wanted to have you on. So I just want you to know that for me, the work that we're doing here in this program is integral to the kind of work that I try to do inside companies as well.
I agree with you. That's so powerful, because I've been thinking a lot about that myself, that we take all of this with us everywhere
we go. That's right.
Not
That's
just
right.
our family and our friends. It goes to our work, to the workplace. And I think back on it now, having been healed, and I think back with people that I have worked with, and I think, wow, how different the company would have felt, or the environment would have felt, had we had this kind of training or this kind of thinking available to C-level, especially, right? Who's kind of like, it's all coming down from the top, the attitude of the leadership. So,
well, it's so
wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you. A huge job number one for leadership is self-awareness, and most people just scratch the surface of that. So, so getting to that, then where I wanted to go next is I just found it so powerful. You have these 4 steps to extracting our true self. Say more. Tell us about those for the people that haven't read your book yet.
So, as we talked about earlier, I had a really hard time even knowing who the real me was, because I'd stuffed so much of what had happened to me. And then I spent so much time trying to be anything but who I thought I was. And I think this is also something that we all fall into. So I chased success thinking, oh, if I'm this lawyer and I win all these cases and I have all these clients, like, I'm going to be this person, and I'm suddenly going to be healed and happy and not all this shame inside of me. And that's not really how it works. And in fact, I felt I had imposter syndrome for, most of my career. I just never felt like I was good enough. So this part about extracting our true self and excavating our true self is so powerful and needed in this idea of healing and, really finding ultimate self-love. So the four buckets of that, the 4 steps that I had to do a lot of work in, and I think we all probably do, is number 1, rid ourselves of shame. So we get so caught up and bound up in our shame, and we keep these secrets about ourselves, and we think, oh, nobody can know this about me. They're not going to like me if they knew this about me. And it makes us feel less than and dirty and not worthy of things. So the biggest thing in there is ridding yourself of shame. And that is really about talking about what happened to you. And an easy way to start doing that is just, journaling some things, writing it out yourself, and then taking it to somebody you trust. I am not espousing, putting this all over social media or going to work and letting it all out on the conference table. But I'm saying being responsible about how you are going to free yourself from this shame and these secrets you have that you're keeping. And this miraculous thing happens for me, and I witnessed it with so many people, is that when you do this, suddenly nothing feels shameful or dirty anymore. It's like you just felt like that because you were holding it in. The second step in this is soothing your inner child. So many of us have something that happened as a child in those formative years. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't have the capacity yet. We don't have the brain capacity yet to process what happens to us. So many times we carry around those wounds, or our brain actually, as it's forming, is impacted by these different traumatic events. And so we need to learn how to dial back down into that child that's so wounded, and learn how to parent that child, learn how to nurture that child, know how to love and soothe that child. And that can take a fair amount of work, but it's absolutely worth it. The third step is forgiving others. Oh my gosh, this was huge for me. And this was like forgiving my parents. And it was interesting because I could more easily find forgiveness for my father than for my mother. I felt like my mother was supposed to have been my protector. So it took me a a long time and releasing a lot of rage. And I mean, I had rage for her. And that's something else. I think when we have these emotions, we get ashamed of them, and we think, oh, we can't say that. You can't say I have rage against my mother. Yeah, you actually can. And you should express these emotions, because emotions have energy. And if you keep suppressing them, they will cause dis-ease in your body and very possibly disease. I mean, that is scientific. I am not making that up. And the last fourth step is forgiving ourselves. We get so caught up in this idea of all the things we did wrong. And I know for me, it was interesting because I really didn't get into this until, my early 40s. And I had to grieve this whole situation of, well, gosh, I spent 20 years locked up in this half life where I could have been really being my real self and really being like who I'm in here to be and really loving myself. But everything happens when it happens, and healing takes as long as it takes. So forgiving ourselves is crucial and important, and it requires a lot of compassion and a lot of patience.
Indeed, indeed. Well, that brings me where I wanted to come next. I mean, I'm well aware, at least concretely or logistically, that researching, writing, and sharing this book has had to profoundly change you. So I'm interested in, how would you describe that transformation? What was that for you?
I had so many versions of this book. I worked on this book for a very long time. And I mean, 8 years. I had different versions of this book, and none of them seemed to really hit or to really feel right, or I would not quite get a deal I wanted, or I don't know, just something never felt right about it. And when I took it off the market and I reformatted it into this formula, right, and then really made it more this like journey of this mixture of a memoir and self-help, it really felt like this is it. This has to be it. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted people to feel like they wanted to feel like we were friends, and I was walking them through this journey they were on. And so that whole process was so cathartic for me, because I started out sobbing and crying and all these early drafts. And somebody very wise told me, they said, okay, these aren't the ones you're going to use, right? Like you have to let all that out. So one big thing I want to say to people about that I could draw a parallel to in this whole journey of me writing this is that, and where I want people to get in their journey, is all of these things I was able to write about them in this version of this book that people could buy and read. I don't have an emotional charge to them anymore. And now they almost feel like somebody else's stories. And so I want people to get there. I want that sense of emotional freedom for people where they don't have an emotional charge to those things that happen to them anymore. And I would say that the beauty of what happens also to me at the end of this, or where I am, not in the end, but where I am right now in this journey, is that I run across people, I run into people, and they tell me, oh my gosh, I just met somebody the other day, and they said, I read your book and it broke me wide open. And I was like, in a good way? And like, yes, I actually took time off from work, and I went deep into therapy, and I took your book and I answered all the journal prompts, and I took it to my therapist, and I was like, this is what I want to work on. I had been hiding all this this childhood trauma. So it is this continual, beautiful journey for me where I am helping people get to this emotional freedom part where they don't have this charge about the negative things that they've happened that have happened to them.
They've left those bags behind at the railway station where they should be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, so then the next logical place for me to go then, and I've been very interested, I mean, the transformations in life. I mean, you don't practice law anymore, correct?
I do.
Is that right? You left it behind. So I know that you're out helping people with their stories and such, but what are you doing with your precious energies and your time?
I am such a believer in this book. So I am out there speaking. So I'm doing, keynotes. So I'm speaking wherever I can. I am right now trying to get a TED Talk lined up. I'm building a course around this book and this idea, because I want to offer more information and I want to expand on it, and I want to offer some meditations and things and other assets that really helped me that I couldn't make part of the book just because of what it is and the format it is in. So I'm continuing this my life's work of this. And I will say that growing up, I told you I loved books. And I don't know, maybe 5, 6 years old, I remember thinking that I wanted to be a writer. And I didn't really know what that meant, but I knew like I wanted to put words together and things. And law school, like I said, was my way out. It was, an escape for me in a way that I saw that I could survive and make money. But I would say that it was a beautiful choice because those skills have come so in handy, and I would never change one day of that. And it makes me appreciate being a writer and having this freedom to be a writer so much more.
Mm-hmm. So 2 things. One, it's not lost on me that, your father went to the penitentiary when you were age 12 and you became a trial lawyer. That's just a very interesting sort of piece of your story. Second thing I wanted to say really quick
criminal defense trial lawyer.
Yeah, no less, right? Is I curated an anthology of women's stories of how they discovered their purpose and are now serving from it. And one of the very known paths to purpose is learning what ails you in life. What has ailed you in life? What have you learned about dealing with that you can teach other people? And that seems to be, to me, to be your path. So I am wildly happy that you are pursuing this full time. I think the world desperately needs it. And you are uniquely positioned to be able to give this the message and the teaching in a way that is so raw and accessible.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do feel that it is my life's calling. And when I meet people, like I shared that story with you, it just makes me, I just got to chill. Whenever that happens, I know I'm doing something good or saying the right thing. So.
That is exactly right, Karena. No, I'm delighted. I'm just very grateful that our paths have crossed. I think your work is very, very powerful. We're coming to a close here, and you may not know, but this show is listened to by people around the world, and they care about trying to either improve or better connect with their work in a more meaningful way that allows them to contribute. They want to grow into becoming more inspirational leaders. They want to be part of organizations that are doing something that betters the world. What would you like to leave them with?
I would like to leave them with the idea that no matter what has happened to you in the past, you are worthy of a big, beautiful, bright life. And there is no reason to hide anymore in that negative self-talk, the negative loop, the stories that replay in their heads. And I would also love to offer your audience, that very important first step we talked about, the acknowledging your story and how hard that can be. On my website, I do offer a free acknowledgement guide, which is a beautiful way to get started in the journey. So they can find that on my website.
Awesome, Karena, and I will give that to them in just a second. I want to thank you for coming on the Working in Purpose podcast. You've been a beautiful contribution. Happy to know you, and I can't wait to get this out into more people's hands. And I want to see you do that TED Talk. Let's get to it already. I have to do one too, by the way, so maybe we could do it together.
Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. All right.
Thank you so much, Elise.
So welcome. So welcome. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to continue connecting with Karena Kilcoyne, the work she does, and definitely check out her book. You can start by going to the website she mentioned. Let me give it to you, and then I'm going to spell it for you as well. It's KarenaKilcoyne.com. So that's KarenaKilcoyne, KarenaKilcoyne.com. Last week,
they can also get their release with Rise Above the Story. That might be easier.
That's even easier. Yes, riseabovethestory.com. That's even easier. Okay, if you missed the show last week, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on air with David Pearl, the creator and founder of Street Wisdom, which provides workshops of curious discovery around the world. He's also the author of Wonderful, First Wonder in the Everyday. See you next week for yet another nourishing conversation to help you become more of an inspirational leader and build your destination workplace. Remember that work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.